I am the serving pastor here at Pentecostal Evangelistic Outreach Church. I know that sounds like a whole lot to say PEO for short. My wife Lisa and I welcome you, and we are so glad to allow our space to be open for the community to be able to come in to gather. And so to Sister's Place, to the East New York Restoration LDC, the Executive Director, Sister Colette Peen, and to the chair of the December 12th, Omar Waleed Clay. I want to acknowledge the former Assembly members and council members that are here with us, Charles and Inez Barron, who have done such great work. Such great work within our community. Miss Mary Bassett, she's here. Where is she? Yes, thank you. Yes, former leader of the City Health. Former New York City Health Commissioner. Yes, so we are grateful for all of you in your respective places. If I missed anyone, believe, charge it to my head, not to my heart. We are appreciative of your continued service and support in our community because it's going to take all of us working together. And to our distinguished guest speaker this afternoon, I'm looking forward to hearing from him, Dr. Gerald Horne.
The enslaving class knew that the slaveholders' republic, the Confederate States of America, had surrendered in Appomattox in April 1865. So then the question should be asked, why didn't the enslaving class brief the enslaved as to what was going on? But actually, the truer story, as you probably know, is that the Emancipation Proclamation signed by Mr. Lincoln on January 1st, 1863, did not necessarily apply in the state of Texas. The state of Texas was in rebellion against the United States government. The remit, the jurisdiction of the Washington-based government did not extend to Texas. It would be as if Washington today decided that all of those subjected to wage theft or perhaps even enslavement in Mauritania, for example, were free. Now, unless Washington chose to enforce that through a hammer and hammer blows, it would be somewhat irrelevant. And certainly the Emancipation Proclamation, in essence, was not relevant to Galveston nor relevant to Texas in general. What was happening in Texas, where the Old South, that is to say slavery, meets the so-called Wild West. Texas was the site of some of the fiercest battles of the indigenous population against the settlers, particularly the Comanches and the Apaches heading west to the New Mexico border. And so Texas was also the Confederate state least damaged by the U.S. Civil War. Certainly unlike neighboring Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, for example. And so the idea in Texas, as Juneteenth approached in 1865, was actually to continue slavery. That was the dastardly diabolical plan that was in mind. How did they plan on doing that? Well, this intersects with another holiday, the Chicano holiday, Cinco de Mayo, which marks a victory of Mexican forces, patriotic Mexican forces, over a French puppet government that had been installed in Mexico in the early 1860s. And so that puppet leader, Maximilian, was going to cooperate with the enslavers in Texas by repudiating the abolitionist decree in Mexico decades earlier under the leadership of a president of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero. And there would be this sort of last gasp, if you like, of the Confederacy. But what happens is that the U.S. forces, many of whom were of African descent, recall that the turning point in the U.S. Civil War, which helps to prompt the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, was that the Lincoln government was actually losing the war up until about 1863, and as a war-fighting measure, the idea was to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which would cause a fast break of enslaved Africans into the ranks of the Lincoln Army, which in fact happened. 200,000 black men ultimately served with the Lincoln Army, and by the way, it's depicted, I would say, rather well in one of the last Will Smith vehicles, speaking of emancipation. Anybody see Emancipation? Yeah, you see it. It's interesting. It's about that story about these black men fighting weapons in hand against enslavement. And so Texas was then subjected to a pincer's maneuver by the black men in blue and the patriotic Mexican forces, who ultimately were able to capture Maximilian, the French puppet leader, try him in a pro forma sense, and then execute him on June 19th, 1867, 2 years later. And that's yet another reason why Juneteenth is worth marking, because if June 19th, 1865 does not resonate with you, or perhaps June 19th, 1867 will resonate with you, because that certainly was a major and devastating blow against the idea of continuing slavery in Texas after the Confederate States of America had surrendered in April 1865. Now let me reel back a bit to the question of Texas. And of course, it's represented in the book to my right, to your left on the table, the Counter-Revolution of 1836. And what that title represents is that Texas, or Tejas, was formerly a Mexican province. As noted, under the leadership of Vicente Guerrero, they had moved to abolish slavery. The so-called Anglos who had been invited into that territory prior to abolition were not sympathetic to this idea of abolishing slavery. I'm speaking of those so-called Anglos who rather ostentatiously then gave their names to major cities, Sam Houston, Stephen F. Austin, et al. They revolted against Mexico in order to perpetuate slavery forevermore. Interestingly enough, they argued that they were walking in the footsteps of 1776, and there's something to that, although that may come as a surprise to many in the United States of America. It actually comes as a surprise to many in Texas, where these events took place. And so they fought this bloody war and succeeded, not least because of material support from the United States government and neighboring Louisiana in particular, and set up the independent Republic of Texas. It was an independent country, which actually had pretensions of challenging the United States of America, and in fact began to challenge the United States of America, this so-called independent Republic of Texas, in the lucrative field of enslaving Africans. The Lone Star flag of the independent Republic of Texas could be found off the coast of Cuba, could be found off the coast of Brazil, could be found off the coast of Angola. That is to say that enslavers from Texas in Texas slave ships were sailing to Southwest Africa, Angola, manacling and handcuffing Africans and then dragging them across the Atlantic, not only to Brazil, the largest market of all in terms of enslaving Africans, but also to Cuba. If you look at your map, there's a straight shot from Galveston, Texas, into Havana, and then of course bringing them into Texas itself. The problem for the enslavers in Texas is that they could not withstand the campaign that had been launched against them by abolitionist forces globally, spearheaded, needless to say, by revolutionary Haiti. I need not tell this audience, I'm sure, that we all owe a debt of gratitude to revolutionary Haiti, which was in the vanguard of the struggle against slavery beginning in 1791, August 1791, when the Haitian Revolution was initiated, up to the victory of the revolution on January 1st, 1804, and then setting up the first Black Republic. And of course, this was the first successful revolt of the enslaved. And like revolutionaries anywhere and everywhere, they had the wise idea that their sustainability as a project would be jeopardized as long as slavery existed in their neighborhood. And in fact, if they were able to read the correspondence of many in the United States of America, that particular supposition would have been validated, because there were those in the United States of America who said, why go all the way to Africa to manacle and handcuff Africans and drag them across the Atlantic? Why don't we just go to Haiti and manacle and handcuff the free Black people of Haiti and drag them to Florida, for example, drag them to Texas, for example. So revolutionary Haiti, with their comrades and allies in London in particular, launched a campaign against independent Texas. Now, I should also say parenthetically that in a few weeks I'll publish a new book dealing with the, actually it's relevant to this discussion. I mean, it's dealing with the attempt to continue slavery post-1865. I just referenced how that was the idea in Texas, post-Juneteenth. But in 1875, Egypt recruited former Confederate officers, military officers, to lead an invasion of Ethiopia in order to convert Ethiopia into a happy hunting ground for enslavers. Now, you may know that Egypt already had subjected neighboring Sudan to this atrocious process. Egypt was a strange creation in the 19th century. That is to say, at once it was being colonized by the Ottoman Turks, and on the other hand, it had ambitions of setting up its own empire in Africa itself. Fortunately, that attempt to topple the regime in Ethiopia failed, and it was followed, as you may recall, in the 1890s when the Italians, the newly minted Italian regime, sought to invade Ethiopia for similar and like-minded purposes. But once again, there was a worldwide abolitionist movement that rallied to the defense of Ethiopia. And as I tell the story in this book, interestingly enough, Russia was a major European power that was subjected to enslavement by the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman Turks were equal opportunity enslavers. Unlike some in North America, they thought that it was not only Africans who should be enslaved. They thought Slavs should be enslaved. They thought Circassians should be enslaved. And they were enslaving Russian nationals as well. And at a time when slave dealers were being coddled by Washington, they were being executed in Russia. And so Russia armed Ethiopia to the teeth in the 1890s, for example. In any case, the point of that digression is to point out to you that there was a powerful movement, a powerful anti-slavery movement, a powerful abolitionist movement that had global consequence and global dimensions, and independent Texas could not withstand the pressure. So in 1845, it crawled into the United States of America, where it has been ever since, although there are rumblings to this very day about Texas seceding once more. And anybody who knows anything about US politics knows that Texas, in many ways, is the heartbeat of the reactionary movement in this country. It's the heartbeat of the neo-fascist movement in this country. And I hope I don't sound pretentious when I suggest that those who are really sincerely concerned about the growth of fascism on these shores should pay more attention to the South in general and to Texas in particular. And when you do begin to pay attention to Texas in particular, you'll see that in some ways it's an extension of the United States itself. What I mean by that is that part of the story of the growth of fascism on these shores is that it has multi-class support, which should not come as a surprise to those of you who are familiar with settler colonialism, the system under which we still endure. That is to say, hundreds of years ago, Europeans began to invade this continent. They uprooted the indigenous, they liquidated the indigenous, and the bloodiness took on atrocious dimensions in Texas itself. And this was done on a multi-class basis. That is to say, it was not just an elite project. If you look at the current issue of The Nation, which is a New York-based publication that has an online presence, thenation.com, you'll see a review essay I did going into this with regard to July 4th. And one of the many reasons why the United States itself, despite what many of our friends on the left tell us was this grand Republican small r experiment of 1776, since that alleged positive moment has embarked on a path of liquidating indigenous populations. There were thousands of enslaved Africans in July 4th, 1776. There were millions on the verge of the U.S. Civil War in 1861. Now, if that was an abolitionist project, and I hate to see a pro-slavery project. And so this question of continuing slavery, even after the U.S. Civil War ends, is something that I think it would be fair to criticize some of our ancestors for not paying more attention to that, because basically what was happening, and this is true to a certain extent today, is that our opponents, our antagonists, were gaining momentum overseas by strengthening slavery, for example, and then using that momentum against us here at home. And that might sound familiar to those who try to keep up with U.S. politics today. And likewise, it was not only the attempt to install slavery in Ethiopia, but I wrote a book some years ago about the attempt to install slavery in the South Seas, enslaving Melanesians and Polynesians, for example, and the Kingdom of Hawaii, then independent in the late 19th century, sought to intervene, and for its troubles, it was overthrown, so that the pernicious system could continue. And I would just add a footnote that even today, there are credible stories of the persistence of slavery. We should recognize that when you are competing against enslaved labor, it drags down wages and working conditions, for example, for us all. It leads to this euphemism called wage theft, for example, which is growing by leaps and bounds in this country. In fact, there was a story in the New York Times just a few months ago about a kind of slavery imposed upon Kenyans in Saudi Arabia, for example. And this book I mentioned a few moments ago, along with Egypt, Saudi Arabia was a major force with regard to trying to implant slavery in the late 19th century, actually well into the 20th century, I believe. So with that, let me now turn to 1776, which I've already made reference to. We've had some victories, for example. In Philadelphia, there was an attempt by the Trump White House to remove the language at the home of first U.S. President George Washington that talked about slavery. Our community rose up as one, and now that language has been restored, but obviously the struggle continues because those who seek to portray the United States as a shining city on a hill have problem reconciling that idealistic depiction when there was enslavement, mass enslavement of Africans, mass genocide against Native Americans. So the remedy, from their point of view, is to erase and eradicate any stories about slavery or dispossession of the indigenous. And I think that, what that bespeaks is the kind of difficulty that we're facing right now in this country. Obviously, many of us are heartened by the smashing defeat imposed upon Washington by the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's a staggering setback. It's going to cause many problems in the ruling class coalition. I mean, you already see the Zionists, many of whom, I'm afraid to say, are in the borough of Brooklyn.
Say it again.
Many of whom, I'm afraid to say, are embedded in the borough of Brooklyn.
The Republic of Brooklyn.
Okay. And you see that Israel is in the snit with the United States over this memorandum of understanding. Now, the world pays attention to these kinds of struggles, because if you come to the conclusion that U.S. imperialism is on the back foot and has been weakened, well then that's a hint that perhaps you need to go on the offensive, for example. The problem we face here in the United States of America is that many of our organizations, leaders, etc., they either don't pay attention to what's going on in the world, or they're in alignment with forces they should be opposed to. Or B, those forces who are losing ground globally will seek to compensate by tightening the screws on us here at home, for example. So ostensibly, this defeat in Iran, which also is defeat for Israel, is good news, but it's only good news if we were able to take advantage of it. And it's not clear to me if we will be able to take advantage of it, although I'm heartened by the fact that on June 20th, tomorrow, forces led by D12 will be in the streets campaigning for the survival and sustainability of socialist Cuba, because we know that Mr. Trump likes to change the subject after he has setbacks. And this press, this so-called corporate media oftentimes goes along, but actually some of our left-wing media oftentimes goes along as well, to be honest and frank. And we already know about the battleships off the coast of Cuba, for example. But I would caution Mr. Trump and the hotheads in Washington to recognize that Cuba has a disadvantage in terms of being close to the United States, but that's also an advantage. It's an advantage in terms of outreach to communities here, as this demonstration tomorrow suggests. But I don't think I'm talking about out of school to suggest that South Florida could be placed in jeopardy if Washington makes the wrong move. Not only South Florida, but Guantanamo, this base that the United States illicitly controls on the island of Cuba, which has U.S. personnel there, they could be in jeopardy too. Now, I hope that's not seen as needlessly provocative, but sometimes these folks in Washington, they need to be reminded of reality, because they just spent hundreds of billions of dollars on our tax money trying to subdue Iran in a 40-day war. Obviously didn't think it through. And obviously it's sort of out of touch with reality. So we have to remind them of reality, because they lose sight of reality. And unfortunately, we're on this ship of fools, at least a ship controlled by fools. And we could be in jeopardy if Washington makes the typical wrong-headed, boneheaded maneuvers. So with that, let me just summarize by saying, A, thank you for coming. B, once again, I think Juneteenth is worthy of marking. It's worthy of celebrating for various reasons. But at the same time, we should not necessarily accept happily this idea that our ancestors were laboring as slaves because they were unaware that slavery had been abolished. I mean, that lets off the hook, as noted, the enslavers, who certainly knew that the Emancipation Proclamation and the surrender of Virginia in April 1865 had taken place. And in any case, we also know that after Juneteenth, you had the convict lease system that arose, whereby black men in particular would be arrested and then leased out to plantations that their ancestors used to work on. In fact, the appropriately named Houston suburb of Sugar Land, which used to be a site of a major sugar plantation, just found there were the bones of black men who had been worked to death as a result of the convict lease system, for example. So I say this all to say in conclusion that we're accumulating quite a powerful case for reparations to the descendants of enslaved Africans, despite the fact that the Trump White House is seeking to intervene to prevent Evanston, Illinois from moving in that direction. It's being countered as we speak by a major summit in Accra, Ghana that's unfolding as we speak, pushing the reparations agenda. So your presence here, the presence of the summiteers in Accra, Ghana, is enough to give us confidence that venceremos, we will win. Thank you very much.